Yeah. Well, hello everybody. Thanks for coming from the other room. My name is Carlos Torres. I'm a sociologist based at Southampton University. And basically, what I'm going to talk about more or less follows my question early in the morning for the ones who were there, which is about talking about the need for qualitative research and mixed methods in ecosystem services research. Because, as we all know, ecosystem services research is pretty much anchored in the natural sciences tradition. These are, you don't see that, you cannot see that well. Well, basically, these are the results for the number of academic publications that have the term ecosystem services in the title. And these ones are for the science and technology section, according to the Web of Science. And as you can see, for the past 10 years, there has been an exponential growth in publications, and apparently now we're around 500 publications that have the ecosystem services term in their titles in sciences and technology. When I look at social sciences, I have also an exponential growth, but I'm not sure it's that clear. Basically, we have half as many publications as compared to sciences and technology. And that, in principle, looks promising, but I started looking at the 10 most quoted papers in social sciences, according to the Web of Science, that has the term ecosystem services in their title. And I'm not sure you can read. What we have basically are about accounting, managing, conservation, and valuing. So basically, we're talking about policy making and valuing ecosystem services. So although ecosystem services has at the core of the concept people, and I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking about communities and societies, we have very few publications that come from the traditional social sciences perspective, which I'm talking about sociology, anthropology, human geography, and so on. Basically, we have policymaking and economics. And drawing on my experience at the Assets Project, which is trying to look at the relationship between ecosystem services and food security, I'm going to kind of try to make the argument that we really need qualitative social research in ecosystem services research. However, how to achieve that is a big question. So as I said, at Assets, we're trying to look at the relationship between ecosystem services and food security, and we're working in 3 different countries. We're working in Malawi, Peru, and Colombia. And at least in the social sciences team, we use a longitudinal mixed methods approach. We started with participatory rural appraisal techniques, lots of cause and effect diagrams, seasonal calendars, well rankings, and so on. We conducted focus groups related to each of these different exercises. After that, we conducted a very lengthy household survey that included typical socioeconomic indicators, but also measured anthropometric measurements for children under 5, and also accounted for different uses of natural resources to cover basic needs. And that was accompanied by a food diary exercise with people when they have to report for a period of 1 week what food items they consume, how much they consume out of each food item, and where did they get the food from. And we did the same quantitative methods twice in each country. Now, today my first 2 examples will come from our experience in the Colombian side. This is basically, I'm not sure if you can see, it's basically more or less in between the frontier between Peru, Colombia, Brazil. And we're talking about an area that is well preserved, hasn't not endured any significant deforestation in the past 10 years, that is covered, over 90% of the area is covered in tropical forest. Almost everybody there claim belonging to any group, Macuna, Yucuna, Ticuna, many different names. And critically, and centrally for my argument, basically they have a subsystem livelihoods system. You know, they have slash and burning agriculture, mostly for self-consumption. Fishing, they have some commercial fishing, but mostly for self-consumption. Hunting, also for self-consumption, and so on. So we have an indigenous setting that is not that well integrated to the market. And that's useful in order to test traditional frameworks for understanding how people behave, because it's not your traditional farmer who harvests the crops in order to sell them to the market and get some income in order to buy things and food. So the first example deals with the coping strategies issue. I'm not sure if you know about it, but in food security, there were lots of discussions about what people do when they are facing food shortages in the 1980s. And there were lots of empirical research, and they found that there is a gradient, more or less, a kind of established process. People initially try to do the least in order to deal with food shortages. They change recipes, they ration their food a bit. When things get worse, they start getting rid of assets, they start selling their assets, initially minor assets such as minor livestock. And when things worsen, they start selling major livestock or major equipment. And when they don't have anything to exchange for food, basically they fall into prostitution, they start begging, they move out, they send children away, or they just endure hunger. So based on that, kind of 10 years ago, there was this quantitative tool that appeared that's called the Coping Strategy Index, which is taking on board this established gradient to establish a pattern and quantify the pattern of behavioral responses from people so that you can identify who is doing more or less okay and who is doing really bad in terms of food shortages based on the practices. And typically what you do is you try to correlate that with using econometric models, associating them with standard socioeconomic indicators and environmental factors such as access to forest areas and so on. In principle, we were planning to do something like this, but in order to get there, we talked to people during our qualitative stage of data collection about the different things they do. I'm not sure you can read about it, but it doesn't really matter. I'm going to tell you about it. In different focus groups about, so what do you do? And they basically told us things that we were expecting because they follow more or less the same pattern I just described. They talked about changing recipes. They talked about traveling farther in order to hunt or to fish. They talked about, for instance, when things got really bad, to give food to the children and not to the adults, and so on. So it was more or less the same pattern. So that's not the interesting bit, really. The interesting bit was that during the qualitative process, I asked the teams to ask them in turn that they can discuss what do they need in order to enable those different coping strategies to take place. So basically, what allows these kind of practices to emerge. And they were talking about, physical assets, financial assets, and so on. But they also talk about things that, for me, are important to highlight, which refer to elements that are not easy to quantify. And actually, I pretty much doubt they can be quantifiable, really. They were talking about, for instance, cultural elements, cultural capital in sociological terms. They're talking about knowledge of hunting techniques, fishing techniques, hunting grounds, fishing grounds, knowledge of wild plants, knowledge of game, and so on. They talk about social capital. They talk about institutionalized forms of mutual support. They talk about the importance of prestige, trust, relationships, access to networks farther away from town, and so on, which whoever works with social capital know that there are no established instruments to quantify. And they also talk about institutional arrangements, not only to access natural areas, and that's the point I would like to make here. It's not about just getting to the area. It's also about a relational understanding of what you can do with the things you get out of the forest or of the river. So for instance, they have this relational approach to what you can do with your natural resources in order to get some food. For instance, equivalent exchange took place with people who are not from your community or who are not part of your ethnic group. Equivalent exchange is something you do with white people. That's how they call them there. The thing you do with the people who are from your community is the gift and counter-gift method, right? So even though you have access to the natural resource, the way you manipulate what you've got in order to complement your diet is different according to the people you're talking to. And also sometimes they have these redistribution policies in town, which you can always go to your neighbor's house and you're going to be offered a meal, because you're part of the community. And visitors also sometimes enjoy that kind of favor, but it's basically for kind of community life level of forms of redistribution. And my point is that these kind of things don't come easily in an econometric model. It doesn't really matter how good your econometric model might be. And a second example comes from the experience of trying to establish this relationship between nature and food security. I mean, in our different tools that I mentioned, we have many different measures of food security. We have dietary diversity scores. We have expenditure estimates to see if people are below the food poverty lines. We have caloric intake, anthropometric measures, and so on, and so on, and so on. And our initial idea, again, is to include environmental variables alongside socioeconomic indicators and see how people are faring from different households according to their socioeconomic profile and the capacity to access natural resources. But again, when we started to talk to the people in our focus groups, the point I'm going to make here is that the relationship they have with the sources of food, with the things they do in order to get the food, and the food itself is quite complex. And again, it's not a main hour for quantification, and it makes even more complicated trying to understand the linkage between natural resources and ecosystem services and food security. So for instance, the plot of land is just not a place where you go to cultivate your crops and you get your food out of it. It's a family space where children and adults work together. It's the place where people conduct their most institutionalized form of collective support, which are called mingas, practically usually for the planting. It's traditionally cultivated that even if you want to set up a plot of land, you have to go through a ritual in order to ask the forest permission in order to set up your plot of plant. And as I said, it's not market-oriented, mostly of it. The fishing, it has, as I said, lots of fishing techniques. You have to get knowledge of the rivers areas. It's mostly a male activity, so it's a form of identity for manhood. It's usually conducted in open space, so it has certain levels of interaction between people. Hunting is almost exclusively a male's activity. It has endured some transition because now people are using shotguns, but there are also lots of knowledge and learning activity and educational activities in terms of learning about grounds, techniques, and so on. And it's the forest, right? And you know that the forest is pretty much a spiritual and a sacred space in many different ways for indigenous populations. So it's just not about going there to hunt a game and then get something to eat. It's a bit more than that. And in terms of foraging, I'm talking here about the palm fruit example because basically it's something that young people mostly do when there is palm fruit available, which is usually at the beginning of each year. And the point here is that the palm fruit is associated with lots of festivities. Almost every single harvest of a palm fruit in the area is associated with a traditional festivity in which the community get together, they forage the palm fruit, they start partying together, and so on. So it's more than just getting the palm fruit from the forest in order to eat. It has a community and a communal sense of identity. And that's the point I'm trying to make here, is that these different relationships between the food sources, the food itself, and the things people do lead to a discourse of the food in the end that talked about the traditional food is something that belongs to them. It's not white people's food. They make that different distinction. It's something that they like, is to their taste. And it's something that is kind of opposite for the kind of activities they do, which are foraging, hunting, fishing, and so on. So basically, not only the food, but also the different things people do in order to get food, and the food sources, they all constitute a complex that explain more or less what people are. So that is, if we are talking about a sense of identity, we need to talk about food and the different activities and different forms of linkages with nature. And this is important for us in terms of quantification, in terms of food security, because, for instance, just coming back to Europe, although it may sound stereotypical, if you've got a burger with a certain number of calories and you've got a pizza with a certain number of calories, an Italian will see differently the pizza as compared to the burger. And it's not just about preference, it's about a sense of identity. And that's why I'm saying that we need qualitative research, because to a large extent, particularly with the indigenous populations, this distinction between nature on the one side and people on the other side as consumers is not something that comes naturally. This is most a construction from our perspective, because societies nowadays, they see nature in a different way. And the example here I have is that this is fishing and hunting, but this is also fishing and hunting. Okay. And the understanding of the relationship with items, with the things people consume, are also different. I mean, the pink dolphin, I'm not saying people eat pink dolphins, although sometimes I think they do, but they have lots of rituals and lots of traditions and lots of stories around the pink dolphin. So the fish is not understood as a commodity. It's not just the thing you eat, it's something else. And I'm just going to give you a third example, which I'm going to go speed up a bit, which refers to our more interdisciplinary section of the project, which is the agent-based modeling section. We're trying to develop behavioral patterns in order to deal with food security. We started with the modelers looking at the participatory appraisal results in order to develop the conceptual framework, trying to identify how they use natural resources, what do they do with the resources, what do they prioritize. They started to use secondary data analysis in order to classify people according to livelihood profiles and to see the kind of practices they do and behavioral responses to food insecurity. And now they develop a more complex model, and they're trying to validate that with our different rounds of household service. And that looks interesting and useful for sure, but the questions I have are the following. To what extent we have a proper interdisciplinary approach here, or to what extent we're basically using qualitative research and qualitative findings as a stepping stone for quantitative measures. So to what extent basically one method is serving the other instead of having two different traditions talking to each other on a leveling ground. And as I said, that's important because all the different nuances that I mentioned in my first two examples are largely lost when we try to kind of put them in a quantitative framework. And of course, we have this debate now in our project, but we have been ongoing there for 3 years and a half, more or less. And so it's an iterative process. We have lots of reflections and discussions there. But how do we get to the final end, which is interdisciplinarity and hopefully transdisciplinarity, is a big question mark, particularly because we don't really have all the time in the world. And for sure, one thing we need is to have people who will listen to each other and who are open and flexible to make spaces for qualitative perspectives. How do we do that in ecosystem research is a big question mark. That's my final slide. Sorry, I have to speed up a bit. Is that, first of all, the problem we have in ecosystem service research is that social sciences and are minor players in this game. Anyone who comes from anthropology, sociology, or human geography and who does qualitative research will know that as compared to modelers and mapping techniques, we are not that central to the debate. So we have a power differential there in the ecosystem services academic field. Secondly, is that the other problem we have is that, we have modeling, we have biophysical processes, and in the natural sciences tradition and ecosystem services research, what they would like is to have predictability, replicability, a certain level of measurement error, quite well estimated. That's something that qualitative approaches cannot provide. That's not something that we can do. And at the same time, one thing we expect to do in ecosystem services research is to scale up things from the local to the global. But as soon as we start scaling up, the voices that we've got at the local level get lost. Because if we go to the global level, an indigenous population from the Amazon is going to be compared the same when indigenous population from the Andes, which is going to be compared the same as indigenous population from the African region and sub-Saharan Africa, and we can go on and on and on. So the nuances and the complexities of qualitative research get lost to a large extent. We scale things up, although that's something ecosystem services research would like to do. And of course, I would like to say that we have in qualitative research a well-established tradition, and we can oppose natural sciences with a well-structured set of principles and quality indicators and so on, but we don't have it. And for those who have done qualitative research, you know that there are dialogical approaches, narrative approaches, ethnomethodological approaches, thematic approaches, content analysis, and I can carry on and on and on. Without even discussing theoretical frameworks, we have post-structuralism, structuration theory, actor-network theory, functionalism, critical theory, and blah, 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 blah. So we don't have that. So how can we make this dialogue? It's very difficult because in the end, we need money. And policymakers don't like small case studies with lots and lots and lots of words. And that's the question mark. I think that's the point I would like to leave it there. The only two final points, yes, if we have 1 minute or a few seconds, is that the only thing I can envisage is that, first of all, we need to keep on making those points. I mean, we need to emphasize why we are needed. Even we're still minor actors, we're still actors in this game. So that's always good. And secondly, it might be time for social scientists who are involved in this trying to develop their own models and frameworks, right? Rather than expecting the models to cover everything, although they would like to do it. I'm sure that the ones who come from anthropological tradition and a sociological tradition will always have question marks with regards to what extent even very complex systems in modeling or quantitative approaches can be really, really comprehensive for our liking, at least. Well, that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Carlos. Has anyone got any questions for Carlos based on that presentation? Yeah?
All right, so my name is Carlos Alberto from University. So I think you make a really good point about the qualitative information getting lost as it gets scaled up. But is there any mechanism, do you think, that can allow that information to transfer up and make its way up to policy making level or up into larger scale models or larger scale rules that are assigned around ecosystem services? Because I agree with you, I think that information is really key, and you demonstrated really nicely with the cultural links to food that you showed there. But do you have any ideas about how to address it?
Well, I wish I could answer that question very straightforwardly. I don't think there is a good answer for that. However, in many different countries, there are certain policy makers that are more akin to case studies. You know, if you're talking about, for instance, education policy making is pretty much based on lots of qualitative and case studies. You're talking about, for instance, multiculturalism and kind of urban development with regards to multiculturalism. There is also lots of qualitative case studies. But I think that one point we have to agree on, at least from a social sciences qualitative perspective, is that we shouldn't assume that the dialogue between quantitative and qualitative comes from framing qualitative research into what quantitative researchers would like them to be. You know, establishing rules, establishing parameters, establishing margin of errors, and trying to force our way into that, I think is the wrong kind of way of, in order to get there. I think that that's why I say it will be good if qualitative research, you know, we can always do some kind of systematic reviews based on qualitative data and establish certain trends. For instance, the coping strategy index developed initially from qualitative case studies. But something we cannot do is assume that we can propose rules, you know, and laws and predictable results based on homogeneous patterns across indigenous populations or small rural populations. Yeah.
So, me is Munsur from Bangladesh.
Okay.
So, when we are talking about some qualitative information and quantitative information, so, and going to the policy makers, they, from our experience, they definitely need some quantitative information. And the research we are doing in a qualitative level, they are not that much interested, but at the end, they need to know how much.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, can you repeat that for people?
Oh, okay, sorry. So, in the case of qualitative and quantitative information, when we are approaching to the policymakers, they need to know how much in terms of quantitative. And mostly they are not interested to qualitative information. It's a complex system, something. They want to know how much rainfall will happen. They want to know how much, something like that. So I think we need to have some clear idea how we can translate these things.
Yeah, again, I wish I could answer that comment or question. I think that, of course, the issues the policymakers like to know what can they do, black and white. But I think it's also the responsibility, and I think that's the importance for trying to get some interdisciplinarity, it's also the responsibility for quantitative researchers not to sell an idea they're not sure about. If they know and they're aware of the things that qualitative researchers are doing and the nuances related to the different decision-making processes involved in whatever they recommend, they cannot say to the policymaker, this is the plan, or this is the best alternative. They have to qualify. I mean, if qualitative researchers don't have the power to get to the policymakers, if quantitative researchers know what qualitative researchers do, and they are aware of the limitations of their own data, they shouldn't take responsibility as well for doing the wrong kind of recommendations, even though policymakers may not like it. At least everybody will be aware of what are the consequences of incomplete information. I hope. One final point, and that's why we need mixed methods, because unless you put qualitative and quantitative researchers, you know, in the same table, talking to each other, it's very difficult even to ask that from qualitative researchers, because they wouldn't be aware of what the other people are doing.
Thank you. If we just make this the last question.
Mike Morris for WWF. Carlos, thank you very much. I mean, that was very, very familiar, and I deeply sympathize with everything you said about the challenge of the social scientists in this realm registering. But I wondered, bearing in mind the keynote speech, if there wasn't, and you sort of alluded to it a little bit, but that reference to spaces, I wondered if the way to address some of these challenges is more about looking at deliberative approaches, allowing the people to speak for themselves in terms of the scaling up, moving up, influencing higher levels. That link was largely missing, the systemic challenge thrown down by the keynote speech. This was a little bit researchy rather than action researchy as you presented it. Now, as a sort of an advisor who faces all those problems and trying to get predominantly natural scientists to engage with the social scientists, I think, you know, there is a challenge in the qualitative information, but I think it's more about the methods we engage with people. And again, I thought there was a very nice table matrix earlier on with the progress, and stakeholders had moved through, being informed and so on and so forth, through to what was called collaborative. I would argue for more collegiate approaches, more social learning approaches. And I think there's a lot of work going on there where you allow people to sort of voice, to have you create platforms for people to link up with the local government and so on. And indeed, you empower local government to lay claim to the resources from the center. So sort of community-driven development approaches. Mm-hmm. So I think there are opportunities out there. I mean, I totally sympathize with what you're saying, but I think you have to see that sort of research in a broader context of approaches that bring about change. So sorry, it's a rather long-winded question.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think I agree with you in many different respects. I was just trying to frame this within what's going on within the specific field of ecosystem services research because, as I said, I was trying to frame it within this specific emerging area of research, which in any case is very promising because, as I said, even though social researchers might be small actors and not leading players, they're still actors in the game, which is something that you cannot always assume in natural sciences research. And your point about trying to engage more, people's voices in the whole research process and even in the policy-making process, I think it's important because one of the things actually we were discussing with Gisella and other colleagues during the break was that when you've got people's voices, you've got a big question, which is whose understanding of the values or the importance of natural resources you should pay attention to. Because, if, for instance, one thing we have in the Amazon is you've got lots of colonists coming, indigenous peoples trying to resist, these approaches on these invasions and so on, and you've got displaced people at the same time, and you've got sometimes mixed communities. So some people may start seeing fish, as a commodity, whereas some other people still believe in fish as a kind of a ritual, spiritual item, part of the forest. Whose voice is the one that counts? If you were talking about valuing and policy making, you need to engage with these kind of debates and dynamics that, again, are not that easy to integrate into just quantifiable models. So I think that your point leads us as well to the political dimension of this kind of work, which, again, I think is unavoidable if we want to do it properly.
Thank you, Carlos. If anyone does have any more questions, we've got lunch and reception this evening for some more drinks. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so our second talk this morning is from Gisella. So if you want to make your way up. I don't know if everyone's staying or if there's a few extra. I'm not great with Macs. How you doing?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. One second, please. Well, today I'm going to talk. My talk is about the local conceptualizations of well-being in the forest agriculture interface, in the forest gradient, in the gradient of deforestation, and how the conceptualizations, more exactly the indicators that local people use to define their well-being, how do they change? And if these indicators are change within the deforestation gradient, and also if these indicators actually fit all these frameworks that we are using in ecosystem services research. So these are the main two hypotheses that I would like to answer in these 20 minutes today. So I'm also going to talk about Assets project. I work together with Carlos in the same project, Assets, that is about ecosystem services and food security. It's an interdisciplinary project. And we have case studies in Colombia with indigenous peoples, where it's an area where there is a lot of forest, and the indigenous communities, as Carlos mentioned, they depend to a big extent from the resources of the forest to satisfy their basic needs. But also we're working in Peru, in the Amazon as well, but in a totally different setting. It's an area with a very high, alarming deforestation rate in the last 10 years. Almost half of the forest has disappeared because of logging, and also because of conversion of land to palm oil production. And the third place where we are working is Malawi. And Malawi is the area that has already been deforested. It's the other extreme. It has already been deforested. So people have to struggle day by day to make their livelihoods. This is possible with an international and interdisciplinary team for the project. Well, I already mentioned what is the objective of the presentation. So, okay, now it's better. Ecosystem services and human well-being. All of us, we know that they are intrinsically related. And regarding human well-being is a multidimensional concept. It's dynamic, it's changing. There is no agreement among the scientists what is the right definition of well-being. There are different definitions, objective well-being, subjective well-being, and there is our as Western scientists, our perspective of well-being, but also local people have their own perspectives on well-being. Well, and particularly, it's important to know this, the local concepts of well-being, because the local people who make the rural poor, they make use of the ecosystem services, and these are important components of their well-being in the way they have their own interpretation. And also, there is a growing amount of literature proposing different frameworks. There are different frameworks and different indicators and different metrics to measure well-being proposed by scientists. So before I continue, as an ethnobiologist, I'm an ethnobiologist myself, I like very much to distinguish between the ethic and the emic approach. So the ethic approach is usually related to the perception of the researcher of the object of a study, of nature, of people living in nature. It's our own perception. This is the most common. And the emic approach is referred to the classifications and conceptualizations of local people, in the way they perceive the world, in the way they perceive their interactions with the environment, using their own language. So usually in ecosystem services research is more frequent to see the ethic approach rather than the emic. Well, rural communities will make direct and indirect use of ecosystem services, and they will make decisions about ecosystem services trade-off in order to ensure their well-being in the way that they will perceive it, their own well-being. And also, it happens that the same ecosystem service could have different effect on the well-being of different users, of different people. And local people's perception of well-being, and there is research on that, may really differ from the results of conventionally used indicators of well-being and quality of life. However, what happens? Ecosystem services research usually neglects these local interpretations of local communities in the way they define their well-being. And this is certainly important for communities along the forest-agriculture interface, because the access to the forest and the degree of deforestation is going to affect their livelihoods and their perceptions. So these perceptions of well-being are also evolving. Some communities, they told me that they had some definitions of well-being 10 years ago, and they changed with deforestation. So this is a very dynamic concept also within local communities themselves. Well, the methods for this study, participatory role appraisal, already Carlos mentioned that. We conducted many exercises, but today I'm going to focus on the exercises of well-being. We asked for the local people to give their local definitions of well-being, the cultural domains, but I'm not going to focus on that, otherwise there is not enough time for today. But what I'm going to focus is on the local indicators that local people use to differentiate the socioeconomic groups. Also, we did some work to place the communities in the forest deforestation gradient with a team of Terra I at CIAT, and we compare the local indicators of well-being with conventional frameworks like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, and the Human Wellbeing Index. So the study areas, like I told you already, we have La Pedrera in Colombia, high forest cover, low deforestation, Pucallpa in Peru, high forest cover, but lots of deforestation. And Somba in Malawi, low forest cover and low deforestation because there is no forest cover. In La Pedrera, Colombia, like Carlos mentioned, indigenous communities whose livelihoods depend to a big extent from the ecosystem services. In Peru, we have indigenous and mestizo communities, and there is this change that they are switching from more slash and burn agriculture to more income-oriented agriculture, like palm oil plantation, for instance. And also struggling with the decrease of ecosystem services. And in Malawi, some rain-fed agriculture, but then we have like two groups, those that are better off, that are mainly working with livestock, and those that are worse off, that they are trying to get an income, but this is not really stable. So, and they are facing difficulties because of the lack of ecosystem services. Before I move to the results on the indicators of well-being, I would like to share with you, only to make a parenthesis, to give you a taste of the conceptualizations of well-being. I wrote down here two examples, one from Boricada and the other from Camaritawa, multi-ethnic indigenous communities in the Amazon. I left them in Spanish because I just wanted to keep their own words in case any of you understands Spanish, but I'm going to translate them for you. So, for Boricada, they said that well-being is to be in good relations with the territory, with the land, to maintain, to preserve the environment in a territory where you are not making any damage. And they talk a lot about this reciprocal relation with nature. You don't have to damage or harm or exploit nature because you have to preserve it so then nature can provide you well-being. For Camaritawa, they said that well-being is a social well-being together with the environment. So the environment is going to have everything, is going to satisfy everything. So in these two definitions, we see that nature and people are not separated, they are together. They are not separated in boxes, like the frameworks we're used to. Well, before I will show you some of the results that I have. Like you see, this is a beautiful quantification of qualitative data. So, in total, we have 165 different indicators that local people use to differentiate the different socioeconomic groups. On average, there are like 16 indicators per community. So this is a trend line. We can see here on the y-axis. On the y-axis is the number of indicators that the communities mentioned. On the x-axis, we can see that there is a gradient of deforestation going to that side. So the communities on this side have more forest, and the communities on the other side, they have less forest. So we have Colombia, Peru, and Malawi. And we classify the indicators, the local indicators, according to the reliance on ecosystem services. So we could see that in the green and red lines, the green one is the direct reliance on ecosystem services, the red one is the indirect reliance on ecosystem services. The number of indicators are variable. But we can see that there are more indicators that rely on ecosystem services to this side. That is the communities that they have a bigger forest area. There is a yellow line because there are indicators of well-being that do not rely on ecosystem services. And what is interesting is that the two communities, Boricada and Curare, that have more forest area, they don't have one single indicator that is not related to ecosystem services. And then, the stars are the indigenous communities, just to make the difference. And the blue one is the total number of indicators. We don't have statistics or something that we can prove this. We are just quantifying qualitative data. It's just to show you the trends in a graphic way. So, but I think that the most interesting thing from here is to see this variability in the number of indicators that communities are using. So yes, our first hypothesis, these indicators change across the gradient. The number of indicators change across the gradient. So then we have some questions also. To what extent the reliance on ecosystem services explains this variability? Because there are other factors, political, cultural, institutional, that also might explain these differences. So now I'm going to show you some analysis we did. So we tried to fit the local indicators of well-being in the frameworks most popular for ecosystem services research. So we took the EMIC, that's local perceptions, and tried to include it in the ethic. I want to be clear that we didn't ask local people to fit it. This is our own criteria. So this is ethic approach. And we didn't ask local people for their classifications in the way they classify and the frameworks that they have to classify and order their local indicators of well-being. So we didn't do this. So we just tried to fit to see if these frameworks actually help. So that was not easy. It was difficult. Because, and I'm going to discuss one by one now, but also one issue is the fitting, and the other issue is the trends that we will see along the deforestation gradient. And some trends is like the more social indicators about social relations, they decrease in the gradient. These are more important for the communities that rely more on the forest. Like health indicators, also they decrease along the gradient, the deforestation gradient. And the cultural indicators are more important to this end, because this is more related to traditional knowledge, to all this reciprocity with nature that is not happening on the other side. And financial indicators usually are more important for the communities that have less access to resources. Well, I'm talking like this, but I don't have here the gradient, the graph. But well, this is the deforestation gradient. So now, first I'm going to talk about how do they fit to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment framework. Here you have it, the deforestation gradient. So I have some pie charts that show the percentage of indicators belonging to each one of the Millennium Ecosystem Services category. So, we will see this trend, like good social relations are more important to this, and like health, that are less important if there is more deforestation. Regarding our experience trying to classify the indicators, although we know that the categories of well-being, like basic material for good life, good social relations, health, security, these are kind of drawn from voices of the poor. But actually, the way that scientists are using these categories, scientists usually are providing their own metrics to each category. And these are very broad categories. Everything fits everywhere. Everything is basic material for good life. It's really difficult. It's very broad. And there are major critiques of this framework that it doesn't really capture issues of access and social differentiation that are very important in the local indicators. So now, the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework. This is not a well-being framework. It's a livelihoods framework, but they use it a lot, like in ecosystem services research, like when the scientists are studying well-being. So, what we see here is also the similar trends. It is less important, the social capital, more important to the areas that are deforested, the financial capital as well. So, what happens with this framework? The sustainable livelihood talks about assets, capital, economic, human, physical, social capital, and not about access to the capital, not about access to the assets. There are some definitions of livelihoods, like Ellie's definition, that it's differentiating that, but the capital is not really emphasizing issues of access, exclusion, and entitlements that are very important in the local definitions. And also another issue with that is that indigenous peoples not only think in terms of capital. The interaction with the environment have different ways according to the traditional knowledge systems, not necessarily in terms of capital. And the Human Wellbeing Index used by Smith, by the Environmental Protection Agency. So we find similar trends. With this framework is providing metrics that makes it more specific, easier to work with, because it's not that broad like others. It has a list of metrics, but it doesn't make it flexible. So it's very US-oriented. It's very difficult to fit it to the local perceptions. Like the only metric for connection with nature is biophilia, but for local people, there are multiple ways to define their connections with nature. So, do local conceptualizations fit the conceptual frameworks? Here we can see this drawing. I actually brought it with me, the original. So this drawing was done by indigenous community. Bacuri is a multi-ethnic community in the Amazon in Colombia. These are illiterate people, and they tried to explain what does well-being means for them with drawings. So this is the original. I have it here. So in the center of their definition of their framework, here. So this is the framework. In the center of the framework is the traditional knowledge. They illustrate the knowledge with a little bench. That is where the traditional authority of the community sits, and reflects, and transmits the traditional knowledge. And they make the decisions about the natural resources management in relation to the traditional knowledge. So the traditional knowledge of nature and interaction with nature is in the center. So these are not separate boxes. Nature and people come together. It's about the interface. It's about the arrows in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It's not about the boxes. It's about the arrows, the relations. So everything is related. All the material and non-material aspects of well-being are related to this knowledge and culture. So how do we fit this to the framework? Is it possible to fit it? So, well, and if we make it fit, we can fit it. Well, we tried, we fit it, okay. But what happens? Like, some indicators could have like different values. Like an indicator could be positive for some communities and negative for others. Like having an administrative position, a leadership position in the community could be, some communities, they said that is super good because they are having more access to an extra income for the families, and others they will say that is totally bad because they don't have time to go for fishing and hunting. So, okay, how do we measure that? If 5 could have a different meaning for different communities. When we try to fit in the framework, we will lose a lot of diversity. We will lose all this big diversity of indicators, these qualitative components that actually are explaining more in depth the real interactions of people with nature and what's important for their well-being in their own terms. And, well, local perceptions are not in the boxes. And I like very much to see the new framework published by the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services because they are acknowledging local traditional knowledge systems. They are acknowledging. I still see the boxes there, but I think this is a big step. And I think that it's important to find a balance between our own indicators. I'm not going to say that everybody has to work like this, well, like to go to the other extreme, that's what I mean, but we need to find a balance between objective, subjective indicators, and local indicators, traditional knowledge system, Western science. We need to find a balance. We cannot force the fit on one hand, but on the other hand, we need to have comparisons. We need to have this science policy interface. We need to compare countries. So how do we deal with that? I don't know. But exactly how, no. But I think this is the big challenge that we have. And okay, so moving towards not only interdisciplinary research, but towards transdisciplinary research in ecosystem services is important. And to use the EMIC as a starting point. Why? Because the use of local indicators will ensure to have positive impact, economic and political impact on local well-being, to incorporate the voices of the poorest of the poor. Challenges, just multi-scale comparisons of well-being. And in closing, I just would like to share with you what Kant said, that the way that we categorize things influences the way we see the things. So there are in the world more than 7,000 languages and many different cultures that they represent multiple knowledge systems and multiple ways of interacting with nature. And I like very much this word, biocultural diversity, so are together. And also problems of loss of biodiversity come together with loss of traditional knowledge. Many acknowledgements, and thank you very much.
That's great, thank you, Gisella. Has anyone got any questions? Okay, if I just take these three, and if you have any others, you can.
Thanks. Thanks, Gisella. Very interesting talk. I don't know if these things are on. Yeah. I just wondered, some of the thinking around well-being at the moment is also looking at feelings of insecurity and whether people feel secure about their future. So in the MEA, it tends to talk about security like being physical security, and sometimes we talk about food security and income security, but also a sort of wide issue about how I feel about the future for myself and my children, etc. And I wondered how much that came up in your lists of indicators that people, their own conceptualizations of indicators. And also, to me, when I was looking at, when you compared it with the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, where we were only looking at assets, but obviously there's more to the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework than just that assets. Yeah. And the vulnerability context also, to me, fits in there as about how people feel about the security for the future. So I just wondered whether that came up very much when you categorized the indicators, whether they sort of went into different categories that could have gone into looking at security and thoughts about the future.
Security just came up with the local indicators. Not in the way of long-term thinking, but more short-term. Security came like in words like to have enough income to deal with a health emergency. And this was a difficult one. Where do you fit it? In income, with like financial, or do you fit it in health? But if security came like mainly in these terms, and also the major concerns were about the preservation of the environment, particularly with indigenous communities. The fear was to lose, the fear was deforestation, and also taking into consideration power relations issues. There are many, well, many communities, they feel threatened because a big multinational will come and extract the resources. So mainly the issues of fear about security is about losing the resources because of all these global trends. And well, there are the way that security is, the metrics that are used in conventional frameworks, like the Human Wellbeing Index, security is like, do the children feel safe to walk to school? It really doesn't. It's not relevant for this context. And your other question was? Okay. And yes, the Sustainable Livelihood Frameworks goes beyond all these strategies, and livelihood strategies, diversification is one of the strategies, vulnerability and all of these. But I just focused on the capitals, that is focused on assets.
That's great, thank you. Did anyone? Oh.
Okay, thank you for a very interesting presentation. So 2 brief questions. One, I was wondering, in this EMIC approach, how do you even frame the question well-being? Like, what type of question do you pose to elicit those responses on well-being? And then the second one is, you presented results of how people define their well-being based on levels of deforestation, but I'm wondering how you control for country-specific variables, because you have countries, different countries with different rates of deforestation.
Thank you. The EMIC, the way we ask the local people during focus group discussions is, how do you define well-being? How do you define? What are the definitions? Like in cultural anthropology, they call it mainly cultural domain analysis. First, you need to understand what is the local definition of the cultural domain, because you may talk to somebody as the same language, but one word could have different meanings for different people. So this is the first step. And I think that this is very important for us when we're working in ecosystem services research to know what local people and the users and the different stakeholders at different levels, what do they mean by well-being, and what do they mean by ecosystem services? Particularly because ecosystem services is not within the cultural domain of most rural communities. So the question was, how do you conceptualize? And after this discussion, that we are analyzing the transcriptions of the discussions of this part. This is another analysis that we are conducting. Then we ask them, okay, which indicators do you use to differentiate the different categories, socioeconomic categories? First, we ask them, which categories do you have? Those that are the worse off, the better off, according to their own terms. And then, how do you differentiate? The indicators do you use for that?
Okay. Then one final question.
Thanks, Sarah Jones, Biodiversity International and King's College London. Thanks, Gisella, that was really interesting. I was just curious about how you measured reliance on ecosystem services, and if that's different to dependency on ecosystem services that was mentioned in the plenary. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear a bit more about how you did that.
That was fitting an ethic approach to an EMIC. So we had discussions. So we based that. So we did it. We didn't, as part of the focus group discussions, we didn't ask local people to tell me what's the degree of reliance on ecosystem services for each one of the indicators. It would have been wonderful to ask them, but we didn't think about it at the time. So actually we did it using our own ethic criteria. So we've kind of forced it from our own perspective. But we didn't do it just out of the blue, because we had all these discussions and all this qualitative information, all this as part of the focus group discussions that help us to make the decisions. Because for some communities, it could be that the same indicator, it depends a lot on ecosystem services, but for other communities, not so much. So then we framed that according to the qualitative data of the focus group discussions themselves.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Gisella.
Thank you.
Okay, so our third talk this morning is Munsur.
Munsur from Bangladesh, University of Engineering Technology. So from Peru, Colombia, we are moving to South Asia. So Bangladesh, the South Asian country, one of the lowest South countries. Yeah, and the title of the presentation is Implication of Biophysical Trajectory for Policy Decision in the Ganges-Brahmaputra-Meghna Delta. And this talk is the part of the research outcome from ESPA Delta project. And I am presenting on behalf of the entire consortium of this project. And if we would like to know the ecosystem services in the GBM Delta, we can get the information that we have a diverse number of ecosystem services because we have a number of different environments within a very small country. The marine environment, the brackish water environment, the fluvial or freshwater flow environment, and these are creating a lot of opportunity to the people living in this area. And within 100 kilometers of the coast, accommodates 1/4 of the national population. So this area is quite flat and subject to encounter different kind of stresses. For example, the river flood sediment flow is coming from the entire GBM basin to this very tiny country. And a lot of sedimentation, subsidence, salinization, waterlogging, storm surge, polarization, these kind of things are happening inside this area. And together with this, the upstream land use changes, global climate change, and growing population and economy are creating some additional stresses to the system. So with this, when we started the project, almost 4 years passed. So through a number of iterative processes, consultation processes with the stakeholders, the policymakers, local community people, we could understand the need of the different level. For example, the local people and the policymakers need to know what would be the extreme floods and storms in this region, and what would be the intense rainfall in this region, more summer drought, increased river discharge, or decreased river discharge. There's a number of questions coming because the long-term planning, we say delta level long-term planning is going on in the country. So a lot of questions we need to answer. And subsidence, what will be the amount of the subsidence? and salinization, the salt intrusion in the system, and increased erosion if the sediment is coming, how much, and what will be the erosion in the coastal region, and sea level rise, what will be the scale, and how the spatial development will be integrated with these changes. So these are the questions we could formulate through a number of consultations during last 4 years. And finally, the potential impact of these on ecosystem resources, for example, agriculture, fisheries, forestry, fresh drinking water, infrastructure, disaster preparedness, etc., at the different time scale. So these are with this, we try to understand and then formulated this science question that what are the key drivers for this and how these change with time and how do they interact and what are the consequences of the changes for the ecosystem services of Delta and how will these affect the people, particularly the poor, and how on policy processes use this science. With this, we clustered the project into 6 work packages, and stakeholders' engagement is one of the strong components of this project with scientific analysis. And I'm going to share some of the snapshots of the work package 5 that is heavily depending on the biophysical modeling exercise. So this is a very big consortium team working in UK, Bangladesh, and India, and more than 100 people are working directly and indirectly in this project. And this is one of the meetings we meet 6 monthly. And this is the framework on which I'm going to share some of the snapshots of the biophysical processes or modeling results will happen in the future that will be useful for the planning processes. And you can see we are dealing with the climate model, the basin scale model, the delta scale model, the physical processes, and also ecosystem services. And to know that, we need to know the scenario, what likely the next, say, 50 or 100 years, the region is going to encounter the stresses. And to have this, we need to know what is the past of these stresses. And we had an exercise that for the last, say, 50 or 60 years, the provisioning services, the green line, is increasing in the deltaic region. But in terms of the regulating services, for example, the water availability, water quality, and land suitability, things are degrading. So we need to have a trade-off. And to do this, we try to formulate a kind of scenario that will be fed to each of the models, like climate scenario, catchment model scenario is how much flow is coming and how much sediment is coming, what will be the groundwater situation and salinization. And then at the end, the Bangladesh part, we need to know through this kind of delta scale model, fisheries, mangrove, agriculture, and finally the how to integrate these results, something like that. And for the scenario model, Metafish worked with us, and we could understand that in the coming century, this much of temperature, this much of rainfall will change, and this much of sea level rise may change. And for the to understand the shared socio-economic pathway, we followed 3 different indicators, like the increasing socio-economic challenges for mitigation and increasing socio-economic challenges for adaptation. And in our project, we took 3 different scenarios. For example, more sustainable scenario, that is the less stresses challenges, and then business as usual, and finally is a less sustainable scenario. And combining these climate and shared socio-economic pathway scenario, we try to formulate the scenario that will be used for the modeling exercise I outlined earlier. And not necessarily this is the final situation. We need to quantify these things. This is the biggest challenge. So to do that, we had a number of stakeholders workshop at different level to understand their feeling together with our scientific knowledge. And then we tried to generate this kind of scenario, like this 18 scenario we had the exercise in the delta scale model, that how much discharge is coming, and finally we want to know the snapshots of the different trajectory that I outlined earlier. So if we would like to go to the snapshots of the catchment models, we can see that the river flow is changing in the coming century, and potential for increasing flooding is happening, and dry season flow will be prolonged, and extreme low flow duration may increase, and these will be further impacted from the neighboring countries' infrastructural development and water regulation. And if we look at the sediment flow, because of the climate change scenario, river flow will increase, and there will be corresponding increase in the sediment flow by the end of this century. And the planned damming activities at the upstream catchment may reduce this flow. So we have a number of uncertainty, but we run like this, that the sediment flow will increase, and the sediment flow will increase this percentage through the Ganges, through the Brahmaputra system, and this will be again recirculated in the entire GBM basin. And about the salination of the groundwater, we had understanding that the lateral seawater intrusion is an extremely slow process, say scale of 1,000 years, and the sea level rise will have a little impact on increase in the groundwater salinity over the small time. Say small time means 100 years, it's a longer time, but in the geological scale, it's not so longer time. And this is the situation of the groundwater salinization. And if we would like to see what will happen about the groundwater salinization in the first aquifer, then we can see at the end of the century, the salinization will be much higher. And with all these results, if we would like to see the snapshots of the delta scale models, it's a lot of things, so I'm going very quickly. Yeah, 5 minutes, yeah. So snapshots of the delta scale model. Then we are going to share some of the snapshots of erosion sedimentation in the delta, flooding situation, cyclonic storm surge situation, salinization, and the relationship of these parameters with agriculture, fisheries, Sundarban mangrove forest. So in case of the sedimentation, we could find that the land subsidence in this region will be largely compensated by net floodplain sedimentation, and with the increased sediment load, net accretion increases in the eastern and western century. This is the western part, this is the eastern part. And right now, for example, the active morphodynamic erosion sedimentation process is going to happen in this area, but after say nearly end of the century, we will have the changed pattern, and the coastal flooding will also change at the end of the century. And you can see we have a number of polders. So polders are going to overtop in some of the polders by the end of the century. And in case of the storm surge, the present day situation is the inundation area and depth of because of the storm surge is something like this. But if we go through the end of the century using the different, sorry. Anyone can help? anyway, I'm continuing. So with these different kind of scenario, we could find that because of the physical changes, the agriculture production, the fisheries production, and the mangrove forest will be severely impacted and will be influenced. And for example, the salinization will change, and the threshold for the different ecosystem services, agriculture, forestry, and fisheries will change. And the salinization of the and climate change impact on agriculture, so production will change, and it is very closely correlated that the salinity increases and production decreases. And about the fish production will be greatly influenced by the productivity of the system. So Sundarban mangrove forest will be impacted by different kind of sea level rise, that how many percentage of Sundarban mangrove forest is going to lose by the end of the century. We can get information with the species change. What will be the species change because of the salinization. And also Sundarban mangrove forest, how much Sundarban mangrove forest is giving us the protection against storm surge, we can get seeing the different scenario that if the Sundarban mangrove forest is absent, then this much of inundation will happen in increased pattern. So if we would like to make a summary, then policy implication of biophysical trajectory is the climate scenario is giving us the answer of some of the questions on rainfall and temperature that the policymakers and local stakeholders raised. And the catchment scale model are giving us the quality and quantity of the water flow, the sediment flow, and the groundwater salinization, so that these can be useful in the policy-making processes, and also local people can have some idea what is going to happen in the next century. And the delta scale model, for example, floodplain erosion sedimentation, impact on fisheries, impact on mangrove forest, and impact on agriculture is going to give the answer. So with this, I'm finishing my presentation. I think I am in time. Yeah?
Okay, has anyone got any questions? Thank you, Munsur, by the way. Any questions? Yep.
And thanks for your presentation, it's very interesting. So I'm just interested in regards to how you've done modelling on quite a large scale. So is there some idea of how the landscape can be managed and the ecosystem services can be managed to try and prevent some of what you've predicted, some of these very negative impacts that some of your scenarios have predicted?
Well, I couldn't get exactly what the question is. Can you?
So what type of? So you've highlighted how there are all these impacts going on around the certain biophysical processes and how they're related to ecosystem services to a certain extent, and you've shown that you've modelled that at the landscape scale. And some of your scenarios have predicted quite negative or quite impactful outcomes.
Yes.
So what can be done, or is the project looking at what you can do in terms of managing at that landscape scale to try and prevent some of those worst case scenarios actually happening over the next 100 years?
Thank you very much. Actually, we are going to have a companion presentation from the next presenter, Professor Robert Nicholls, and how these things are going to be useful in the policy-making process in an integrated framework. Then this model or this process will give the policymaker a choice, not imposing them, please choose this. They can have a number of choice with a number of if and then question and answer. Then they can choose their best. So the policymakers are very closely involved in this project, so that at the end of the project, if you are going to give them the results, what is this? From where it is coming? This kind of question can raise. So from the very beginning, for the last 4 years, we are working together. And Professor Robert Nicholls, hopefully, is going to address these things.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mahesh Paudel. I am from Bangor University. Some of the problems that you mentioned that affect Delta in Bangladesh, they arise either at the regional level or some global scale. So how should the country-level policymakers deal with that? Is just adapting to change enough?
Actually, we are using some global information, but downscaling and verifying at the local level, and basically focusing towards the local need, the policymakers' need, together with the local communities' need. So in the formulation of short-term, medium-term, and long-term planning processes in Bangladesh, we are arranging a number of workshops with them, and through which they are getting the information, and they are using, they're going to use it, and well, ecosystem services for poverty alleviation is a new term in Bangladesh, and before this project, there was nothing could realize by the people that it is important, because people thought that it's for the poor, but it has a huge potential. So we are trying to make aware of the people with some science-based evidence in cooperation of the people themselves.
We got one more question? No? Okay, thank you, Munsur. So our final talk this morning is from Robert Nicholls.
Thank you. Do you want to use that mic? Probably I'll use this one, actually. Oh, okay. Do you mind if I use this? No. Probably better to walk. Okay, so my talk will very much build on Munsur's talk, and we'll talk about, I think, hopefully try and answer in part the first question that was posed. And just sort of to give a structure, I'm going to say a few words of introduction, sort of reinforcing some of the things that Munsur said. I want to talk in particular about the sort of analytical framework, and then this thing called the Dynamic Integrated Emulator Model, Delta DM is what I'll be calling it, which is maybe lies at the core of how we're thinking about integration and synthesis within the project, and then talk a little bit about the project's legacy. So, you know, deltas, I mean, again, it's probably worth remembering that Bangladesh is just an example of one of many vulnerable deltas. This is a global map showing how many people, an index of how many people might have to leave due to sea level rise by 2050 if current trends continue. And you can see the Nile, the Ganges-Brahmaputra, and the Mekong all hop out. So there are other places in the world where these issues are relevant with large agricultural populations and poverty in deltas, but Bangladesh certainly is probably the biggest delta in the world with these issues. And so to think about the system, and that's what we're definitely doing here, we're taking a systems view of the problem. We have to think about the coastal delta, the coastal study area we're looking at, which is in the 100 kilometers of the coast. There's a wider delta which goes inland maybe 400 kilometers, so we're not studying the entire delta, we're just studying the coastal part. We must think about the catchments, and we must think about the Bay of Bengal, which is integral to the fisheries. And then, in terms of the drivers that are shaping this environment, things like climate change, but also things like the price of rice. The global price of rice may well have an important influence. These sort of exogenous drivers, which really come essentially from experts, the scenarios there. And then the endogenous drivers, the things that can be controlled at the scale of Bangladesh, where we've been working very much with stakeholders in Bangladesh to develop the scenarios that Munsur was talking about, these business as usual, more sustainable, less sustainable views of the future. Then our study area, which has 14 million people living in it, so just to give you a sort of scale of the study area, and depending on these range of ecosystem services in the area. And then, of course, we need to think about the people, the livelihoods, the land use, so that draws in things like demography, markets, financial security, etc. So we're trying to draw all this together into one modeling framework, which is, to our knowledge, has never been done before. It's been done in the kind of, it's done a lot in terms of expert judgment, but this is actually sort of formally coupling all this together. This is just to show you the land use of the study area. This is an output of the project. It's a sort of composite land use. So we have very, very extensive rice paddy. We have emerging sort of shrimp aquaculture. So that's one of the biggest issues of change in the study area. And we have the Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove forest, or at least part of it, because it goes off into India as well across the national border. So the overarching aim here is to provide policymakers with the knowledge and tools to really evaluate what their effects their decisions are having on ecosystem services and resulting on people's livelihoods. So in plain English, we're really trying to link science to policy at the landscape scale. That's really the overarching goal of this effort. And we laid out some goals and aims in the project. So we wanted to look at the present relationship between ecosystem services and human well-being and health. We recognize that there's lots of hypotheses about this, but to actually really need to do empirical work to look at that, and it turns out, we're not going to say much about that, but it turns out to be a bit more complex than you might think. To explore how these ecosystem services might evolve over the coming years and decades. Up to a century, the Bangladesh government is implementing a Bangladesh Delta plan, which is actually funded by the Dutch government. It sort of mirrors what's been done in the Netherlands and more recently in the Mekong Delta. And so this has come along while we've been doing this work. But we're sort of on coexisting with that effort and talking with them a little bit to analyze how policy might influence these outcomes and promote ecosystem services and human well-being and health. So that's the question that was asked, I think, really. How can policy actually influence it? How can it shape it? To look particularly at, given there's huge uncertainties, are some policies more or less effective across the range of uncertainty? So are some policies robust, shall we say? Maybe they don't exist, but at least to ask that question. And to very much be a participatory approach. So we've been working with stakeholders throughout the project so that the results are relevant, owned, and useful. So Delta DM is really the major effort of integration and synthesis to try and draw this information together in a form that can make this accessible to wider users. And so it's a modeling tool that really tries to formally synthesize the results and then aid analysis and planning of ecosystem services and poverty alleviation in coastal Bangladesh. It's designed to test a range of future scenarios, and it's got this, as you'd expect, it's got this biophysical element, where there's which in itself is quite complex. It's considering the rural livelihoods, poverty, and health, and in that case, we've looked at the census, and we also conducted a major household survey over 3 seasons, so we have lots of empirical data that we've collected ourselves to inform that. And we're also looked at the issue of governance. The Delta DM operates at the scale of the Union, so there's 653 of them in our study area, so it's not a uniform grid, it's based on this political unit on a daily time step, and we can also aggregate, there are 9 districts there, so some of the results I'll show you will be aggregated up to these 9 districts. So there's still some spatiality, but we've aggregated to some slightly larger unit. So who are the participants in this overall process? It's quite interesting. I mean, it can sound very, very technical, but at the end of the day, people do this. So what is the role of different people in this process? And the first sort of key group are our stakeholders. Our super stakeholder really is GED, the Global Economic Division of the Bangladeshi government. That role is sort of developed through the project, but they are really responsible for all the and sign off on all the sort of major planning, infrastructure, investment decisions in Bangladesh. And they are very, very interested in what we're doing in the whole ESPA Deltas project, and they're interested in this Delta DM idea as a way of testing policies. But then there's many other stakeholders in other ministries, various NGOs, the World Bank, etc. There's households. So we surveyed over 1,500 households. So they're clearly very important, directly feeding into this process and indirectly representing the population of the study area. We have our experts, the ESPA Deltas team, the 100 specialists that are working on the project, embodying a lot of different domains of knowledge. which we're trying to integrate together. We have, again, we formally identify a small subset. You could maybe say these are part of the ESPA Deltas team, but we do have people who are formally the integrators, who are building the framework. So a small subset, maybe, the ESPA Deltas team, whose focus is on how we join things together. And lastly, we have the overall sort of users, which is going back to people like, again, interacting with the stakeholders. So Buick, I think at the end of the day, would really be the sort of users applying the model within the context of questions in Bangladesh. And we can sort of look and see how this maybe is organized in a flow sort of chart type thing, saying that, here we have the stakeholders. They were, at the beginning of the project, we asked, what are the key issues in Bangladesh? So we didn't go in with a preconception of what the issues were. They identified over 100 different issues initially, then started to develop these scenarios with them, and then have been discussing what are the policies that they would apply in response to adverse outcomes. And so really, there's been an iterative process, and we've had a whole series of workshops there. Up here we have observations, the households. We also have the HIES sort of surveys that provide quite important information. In here we have all the different oops, what have I done? Sorry. We have all the different the catchment models, fisheries, agricultural production. So we have like the boundary conditions, and then the things that give us maybe the stocks of ecosystem provisioning, ecosystem services that we will have coming out of the ESPA Deltas team. Also things like climate change scenarios. Then here we have the integrators, where the models are, again, we're using, to simplify a lot of the models, we're using the principle of emulators. So we're taking a model that might take a long time to run, running it a lot of times, and then we're in some space, and then we're sampling it to a statistical representation, so it will run very rapidly. These Delta at DM still takes quite a long time to run, even when you have this great simplification. And then we have the users. So that sort of shows you how it all fits together. And then so it builds very strongly on the underpinning of the more detailed work that Munsur was talking about. So climate, hydrology, models of the Bay of Bengal, agriculture, and that includes fisheries. So agriculture, we have some statistical relationships for aquaculture, and then the mangroves. And then the information about households. And so we held these three household surveys over 3 seasons. That was something, again, part of the initial research. We planned to have 1 survey, but we realized that seasons might matter, so we split it. We changed the design after some preliminary work, and defined 21 household archetypes based on the mixture of activities they did in season 1, season 2, and season 3. I don't expect you to be able to read it, but just to sort of see how this is being driven. And about half the people seem to depend directly on ecosystem services based on that. We're also bringing in issues on economic decisions, poverty, and health indicators. And we can also take things like land use and the census and look at associative relationships. So we've got the household survey, which gives us our process understanding, but we can also look at, create asset poverty indices from the census, and look at what might drive areas with high poverty. And what we find is there's an arc of poverty around this area of our study area, and then based on an asset poverty index, and then we can actually link that here in the East, essentially to socioeconomic controls. It's access to markets. Things like bridges would actually be quite a good response to this, because we're often talking here about islands, so it's hard to move around. The red refers to salinity, to high salinity conditions, and the green refers to waterlogging. So we can see sort of 3 different associations that seem to occur statistically significantly with this poverty, and then there are grey areas where we can't explain what's going on. But this actually gives us straight away a simple statistical model that allows us to look at how, if the environment changes and, for example, saltiness increases, then we would expect to see the effects seen here increasing, all things being equal. And so so our key model inputs are climate, hydrology, information on the Bay of Bengal, And we are introducing hazards, so we do have, again, it obviously be nonsense, I think, in Bangladesh not to consider cyclones, so we are introducing storms and considering the role of shocks. We're looking at levees and the polders. I mean, the whole area, well, not the whole, but most of the study area is poldered, so there are dikes or levees around agricultural areas that control water levels and flooding. And then we're looking at the ecosystem services, agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries, and mangroves. Demography, so we have demographic scenarios looking at the economy and different prices and issues around governance. And then the outputs are information on coastal hydrology, salinization, livelihoods, and then we're trying to get, again, this is what we touched on some of the early talks, we're looking at estimates of well-being, poverty, and health. So we've got this associative model, so we can look at the acid-based poverty indicator, but then we're actually using the household survey. We can get a little more sophisticated and start to look at income and expenditure, and look at and look in more detail at how things might change, and also kind of outputs of things like, you know, regional economic outputs can be also sort of evaluated. And of course, this is a big, complex model with lots of linkages, so how do we build confidence that we're doing something here that's actually useful and tells us something about the real world? Well, all the elements are well validated, so that's a kind of key first step when you build these types of coupled models. And then I think then you move on and you start to look at things like the mapped outputs. I mean, particularly we can look at what it's telling us about historical periods up to today, so we can start the model 20 years ago and we can move forward in time to today, so we can actually compare what we see with what we observe today, and then moving on. But I think this issue of is quite a difficult one, and one thing we want to do is a big, full-scale sort of sensitivity analysis of the model. That's not validation, but it's just to understand what really is driving it, and then exploration of plausible futures, where we have the 3 socioeconomic futures and the 3 climate futures here. So we have a 3x3 matrix looking into the future. And just to kind of give you some illustration of some outputs that we're producing, for example, soil salinity, we've done a salt balance from multiple sources at the scale of the Union, which surprisingly enough doesn't seem to have been done before. You see salt balances, but normally at the scale of a plant or a field trial. And so we've introduced the different processes of precipitation, evapotranspiration, groundwater drainage, irrigation, you know, the issue of flood water, standing water, and surface water drainage. So, and all these things haven't really been put together before at the Union scale, as far as we see. Then we can start to look at things like, we can look at tracking cause effect, groundwater salinity used for irrigation. This is something Munsur showed this. We actually model at a daily time step. So this is far richer than any observations you'll find in Bangladesh. And this is just showing, you can't read it, but it's showing it's getting saltier in the dry season, and then then we get the monsoon, and so we get a large input of fresh water, and then it gets saltier again. And there are different lines there because there are different crops. So different crops will have different effects on salinity. And in this particular setup, we find that actually, for these particular setup, we find that the saltiness is actually going up. So over time, the salinity is increasing by about sort of variable. I mean, the blue is almost no change up to red, sort of 2 decisiemens. And so that then you can start to look at, well, what's the income from agricultural crops by district over time? So and you can see that there's variability, and this is partly picking up variability. And you get wet years, you get dry years. But you also see that maybe at times there can be quite abrupt changes. And maybe we're going through thresholds. So again, these are just kind of giving you a flavor of the kinds of results you can produce. For the asset poverty index, you can actually say, well, let's look at 2050, and we can take forward issues around waterlogging, salinity, and you can get maps like this. And what you can observe, the key thing to take out of this is actually there's less difference in this axis than this axis. So the socioeconomic futures are making more difference over the next 35 years than climate change, which I don't find surprising, but I think we talk about climate change a lot, so maybe some other people don't recognize that and think climate change might be much larger in the next 35 years. And climate change is really a longer-term threat than that timescale. And so it's the decisions made on the ground that are really going to shape this environment over that time span. And we can look at things like household level income. And again, so these are just showing different types of income over time. We can look at expenditure, and this is for the different household types over time. And we can look at the sort of overview and look at issues around wealth. And we're still actually tweaking this household model because to make full use of the survey. But we have things like, again, we're aiming to look at issues around loans, both official and informal loans, to again give you a kind of example of the kind of detail that we're trying to produce here. And also looking at things like, looking at sort of, what's happening in the districts. You can look at GDP per capita, so these areas are developing, so that's great. But then we can also look at the distribution of wealth. So again, so we can actually, again, some people are talking about the poor being not acknowledged in processes. So we can look at Gini coefficient. So it's going down in this simulation, but but there's still great inequalities in the distribution of wealth within the study area, and that's sort of that's been mapped there as well. So, I've given you, I hope, a flavor of what we're doing and the kinds of outputs that we would like to produce, or we are producing. And I suppose, again, it's an interesting point that with this Delta DM, so let's say, is it a piece of software or is it a device to get people with from very different disciplines to talk to each other and to actually share and learn from each other? And of course, in many ways, it's both. So we've developed the software as far as we have, and we've got a little further to go. But there's also a lot of learning that is beyond the software. So there are insights which are not represented in the software, but we're still learning things. We're also thinking about this idea of iterative learning with stakeholders, in that this idea of participatory learning. And there's sort of two routes with that. You can think about if you really want to go back and ask fundamentally new questions that are likely to emerge, then you have to sort of go back through the whole team, go back to the experts, maybe to sort of reconfigure the model. But if you want to just look at the different inputs with Delta DM as it's configured, then you can have a much shorter loop where essentially the stakeholder interacts with the user, and the integrators and the experts are just watching from afar as this is used in policy formulation. And we're sort of heading towards that track now, and recognizing that as in the future, as you may want to develop this and new questions emerge, you may have to have some more of these long iterations as well. But that's beyond the ESPA Deltas project. We're not going to be doing that within ESPA Deltas. We had a big workshop on the 16th of September in Dakar at the General Economic Division, sort of very near to the Parliament, with over 70 different stakeholders, where we presented the results. And we were particularly asking about the policy interventions that people would like to look at, and really thinking through what could be trying to tease out. I think it's an interesting observation. People in Bangladesh often say this is a very new way of thinking. So I think there's a learning process for the stakeholders that these kinds of questions might be answered, so that we're asking questions often that they're not used to answering. So it's rather new and experimental in terms of the different workshops. And we're planning another workshop in January in Dhaka. And just to give you a flavour of the kinds of things that the current system could answer are things like looking at the Faraka Treaty, which is to do with the sharing of water between India and Bangladesh, changing polder heights, land zoning policies, new potential crops. You can deal with hypothetical salt-tolerant rice within here, etc. So there's a whole range of questions that this can answer right now. And this Delta plan that's been produced in Bangladesh isn't really able to actually address all these questions at this present time, so that JED are very interested in how we can frame in and sort of shape this in the future. So the next steps and legacy, well, I think ESPA Deltas has produced a range of policy-relevant results. It's not just Delta DM. I think it's a core output, but it's produced, and Munsur has explained that. But Delta DM is a major output. It's going to be an open-source modeling tool. Application and training is in progress. This is actually a training event that happened the day after our workshop in Dakar in September. And actually, we're very pleased that the government, JED, have actually asked us to write a book about the ESPA Deltas project, so which they wish to publish and present to the Prime Minister. So I suppose, in a sense, I feel that is having impact, and certainly Delta DM will be available via our partners Buit and WAPO and JED and others within Bangladesh, and we see this. Fortunately, we also have another project working in Bangladesh, so we're not going to disappear when ESPA Deltas ends. So in other words, the relationships that underpin this will sort of continue in other means, which also, again, is an important, I think, in terms of maintaining momentum and really making sure that this project has a very big legacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Has anyone got any questions? That's great. Does someone have one?
So Colin Bow from John Moores University. So I've got a couple of questions, actually, so I'll try and sneak both in. So we've done some biophysical modelling, and we've done it with a multinational company working in India. And when we did the modelling, we chose to pick quite simple models like the IPCC Tier 1, and we used CropBot as well. And the reason we did that was to make it applicable across companies and across wider use. I'm just wondering how you feel about the level of complexity of your models and whether you thought about that aspect and how did that have an influence on the types of models that you used?
I think there's two elements to what we're talking about here. I think there's the overall framework for analysis, and then obviously there's how you actually implement it and solve it. And I think one shouldn't underestimate the framework, building the framework and having sort of the right conceptual place to even be able to begin to answer the questions. In terms of the models that we used, I suppose, as is often the case, there's an element of pragmatism. The guy that wrote CropBot is down the hall from me. So, for example, CropBot, we had a world expert who was very keen to be involved. So I think you were right. That is a very good question. I think as time goes on, I'm thinking more and more about getting the appropriate models. And there are some interesting questions and standards there. But it's not really a problem we've had to face up until now. Now we're getting maybe more of these coupled systems. We start to think about what are the principles and general rules. And that's probably in research. Initially, we were rather pleased to be able to even build something that worked. So I think the points that but I think that the framework that we're talking about here is translatable to other deltas, without doubt. And then in terms of how you would implement it, I think the models that we've taken are all fairly transferable. And if I was asked to take this to the Mekong or the Nile, I would probably, my first stab would be to think about using what we've done. Although noting, I mean, I picked those two examples. The Mekong is probably rather more similar to the Ganges-Brahmaputra. The Nile, hydrologically, is rather different. So actually, in the Nile, you would probably be forced to use other models, because I think you'd start to realize other processes that don't matter so much here are rather important.
I'll sneak another question. Sorry. My other question is to the stakeholders that you had involved. So I noticed you had some small businesses in some of your lists. But I wonder, as the project's progressing and you've got kind of local government and things involved, whether there's any interaction between larger companies that are concerned about carrying on operations within those areas, and sort of how they might be buying stuff from the smallholder farmers, for example, and how whether they're interested in what's going on in this region long term and how that might affect their risk and their operations and their sustainability and stuff within that region.
I'd say the main stakeholders really are government. Is national. It's really more at the national level has been the real buy-in and so we're talking about national government national NGO or national or regional NGOs, and also donors. So, I mean, say the World Bank were, and UNDP, for example, were at the workshop that I showed the picture of. So we've had, and then so in terms of engaging with the private sector, we have been asked that question, and I don't think really maybe the private sector in Bangladesh is really quite ready to engage with this. But certainly the question has been asked to us, I think, in one of our ESPA review meetings. So I think we are thinking about that. In terms of there are going to be some regional stakeholder events. I think the first one will happen this month. We'll go to Barasel and Khulna, which are the two main towns in the study area, because it's a pretty rural area. And there'll be events held there with local government officials, and in Khulna there's a number of universities, so we'll be engaging with the local academic community and with the NGOs, obviously with the NGO networks. And they've, for example, to communicate it, Munsur could probably say more about it than I can, but a pot song has been developed to present the results at these workshops. So quite a bit of thought has gone into that. But I think, I mean, really, for most of the real stakeholder engagement has been at a higher level.
Maybe just keep it to these three questions and then we can...
Hi, Sarah Jones, Biodiversity International in King's College London. Thank you for that talk. I was just curious, because you're working in quite a rural area, if you had problems with data gaps and how you overcame them, for example, with the Asset-Based Poverty Index. What data were available for building that index across your study area, and if you had to fill in gaps in that data set?
I didn't actually do that analysis. My colleague Fifi Amerko Johnson at Southampton led it. So my understanding is that the data in Bangladesh is pretty good, but I'm sure there were, I mean, you know, but so I can't, I'm sorry, I mean, I would suggest, if you're really interested, maybe you could actually, I can give you Fifi's email and you could actually have a chat with him. But I think, you know, I think in terms of the socioeconomic data, my understanding is that didn't present huge problems. I mean, actually, one of the big problems we had was actually just knowing things like where the channels were. We spent quite a bit of money on surveying the channels, so we could actually move water. You know, saltwater intrusion saltwater needs a channel to flow down, and so actually quite a lot of the basic physical data in Bangladesh is missing. So you know, if I was asked what should Bangladesh do, I mean, I would just say some really very basic data collection would be fundamental in this region on land elevations, because that underpins all development decisions. Every piece of infrastructure you design has to know the height of the land, and I think often you're sort of guessing it. And so I think that there are some really quite important needs there in the physical domain.
Paula Novo from the James Hutton Institute. Well, thanks a lot for the talk. I was wondering whether gender was included in the research through the household survey or through the engagement, because I think it's quite an important part.
It was something that grew as the project went on. So actually, in the last round of the survey, there was some more explicit gender questions. So I haven't presented any results there. I mean, I should say as an aside, I mentioned we're going to continue working in Bangladesh. So we have a project called DECMA, which is looking at migration in Bangladesh, in the Ganges-Brahmaputra, the West Bengal, the Mahanadi, and the Volta in Ghana. And so there, in that project, we have very explicit gender dimensions to the project as well. So we are going to be collecting a lot more data that has very strong gender dimensions within deltas in the coming year or so.
Did we have one final question over here?
Mike Morris, WWF. Can you just say a very little bit about the governance work you alluded to, and whether, I mean, in terms of policy relevant findings, I mean, did any of that work sort of offer suggestions as to how to make policy relevant findings actually get taken up. And just one final observation here. I thought the gender was an important issue, and the last workshop at the end, didn't seem to be any women present. So
that's probably, it was probably overwhelmingly a male audience, yes. The governance work has been looking at both formal and informal access to ecosystem services in the study area, and I think one of the observations is that sometimes many of those there's been informal rules for how these things are done for maybe in place for long periods of time, and that some of those informal rules are now under quite a lot of pressure as the economy becomes more monetized, and and I suppose a bit like tied cottages in Britain, the sort of type thing where people just suddenly find that they lose them. And so that was one of the key things. I suppose the other remarkable thing was an awful lot of the legal framework here actually goes back to colonial times. It's pre 1948. An awful lot of the laws go back to East Pakistan or even to colonial times. And so in terms of formulating policy from this, I think that rather than actually what we're trying to do is, I suppose, facilitate thinking about policy within government, within NGOs, and within wider society. So I think we've identified issues that we feel we can analyse and we can say something meaningful about. I suppose we've taken the view that we want to then discuss with the different stakeholders what the different views are, because clearly generally there are winners and losers when you start to look at these types of analyses. And I don't want to sort of run in and prejudge a certain view. So that's the view that we've taken.
Thank you. Right, well, thanks everyone for their questions, and thank you to our 4 speakers this morning for discussing your presentations. If you didn't quite catch everything, they will be available after the conference. We'll be uploading them onto the ESPA website for everyone to view.
And actually, there's a poster on this actually over in the other room if you want to, if you're interested.